So it looks like G's running a little bit late. I'll go ahead and get the meeting started until he can get here. So going straight to the agenda, let me share my screen and we can get started. Okay. So the only thing on the agenda today is a discussion on snapshots by Sheng. So the PR that she posted is here, number 207. Sheng, do you want to talk about this?
Looks like I'm
there you
on
go.
mute. Yeah, so so many storage systems support Snapshot. It's a way to restore your data back if your original volume get corrupted somehow. But CSI right now does not have this support, so this proposal is to add this support into CSI. So we are proposing to add some controller functions, create snapshot, delete snapshot, list snapshots, and get snapshot. Those will be new controller functions. And should we just go through this? Just okay. And then so this is what you're seeing here, the snapshot ID. This is the create volume from snapshot. So I just want to clarify that we want to support only create a new volume from snapshot in this proposal. So the revert snapshot is a more advanced functionality that won't be addressed in this PR. So we add a snapshot ID in the create volume request. And then in the create volume response, we added a source snapshot ID. And then moving down.
So quick question on that.
Yes.
Does that snapshot ID mean that the snapshot itself should be exposed as a volume, or does that mean that
it's a snapshot? So this one, so probably it couldn't see the whole thing. This one is actually from the create volume request. So we add this optional field. I don't know if there's a way to extend that. So we add this optional field of snapshot ID. So you can create a new volume from a snapshot. So that's what the snapshot ID is about.
Okay. Is the expectation that the storage system should create a net new object that's based on the snapshot?
Yes. So yeah. So basically, you will have to create a new volume from the snapshot. It's not a. We clarified actually in the PR. Clarified that this proposal does not support reverse snapshot, which is you use the original volume and then you basically erase the data on the original volume and copy the data from the snapshot. So that's a more advanced functionality that can be added later as a separate function. But this one is create a new volume from a snapshot. That's what we are trying to address here.
So real quick here, when we were talking about this for Kubernetes, volume from snapshot was the more expensive operation, and restore volume to snapshot level was the cheaper operation and the more common one, right? Like restoring volume to a snapshot level is pretty much universal, but creating a new volume from a snapshot is not supported by every provider.
I actually don't think so, because we actually, so I'm from a OpenStack background in Sender. Reverse snapshot, so that is like you keep the original volume and then you just restore the data to the original volume. That operation is a very advanced and only traditional storage vendor can support it, but not every vendor can support it. So that functionality was added very, very later, very controversial. But create a volume from snapshot, that's a functionality that's been there. It's a required minimum. It's a minimum requirement.
It's the reverse cluster, so it was
Mhm.
I guess it depends on the backing storage. I don't. So both those functions are obviously going to be added at some point. What's the benefit of overloading the create volume call? I kind of opposed to that. I think that it should
Right.
be.
I know you actually mentioned that before, right? I believe this was because this.
Someone's done it once in the field, but I
Right.
don't.
Yeah. I mean myself, I'm fine of creating a new one or overloading this one, but I believe this was some design in this spec.
So I think create volume, it makes sense here. You're creating a new volume, having a separate call for create volume and create volume from Snapshot seems a little silly to me.
What's the benefit of having it combined into
Having
one?
a single method that that creates volumes makes sense. Basically, what this is it's saying it's a modifier on the create volume call. It's saying that go ahead and create a volume, but pre-populate it with the data from this snapshot, right? It's just like any other parameter that you pass in to manipulate or change the initialization configuration of that volume. We don't need to represent that as a whole different method, which would be the exact same method except take a snapshot ID in addition. That seems a little silly.
It just gets ambiguous if you have a storage type that doesn't support snapshots and it's getting called. I don't know. It's going to.
I mean, we have, for example, like secrets that are passed in, right? And not all storage backends are going to support secrets on the create volume call. I don't think this is unusual for the create volume call. There's a bunch of parameters on there which are optional, and this is just another optional parameter.
But wouldn't it be more clear if we had a separate method? I mean, then you know for sure what you're calling instead of like what function parameters you have to pass in.
I think that'll just pollute the API. You'll end up with multiple create volume calls. That just seems weird. I'd strongly argue that if the intended operation is to create a new volume, then use the create volume call. The only difference is that in this case, you're going to be pre-populating the data, and you can specify that through a parameter. The only thing I might like to change is instead of having a single string for snapshot ID, maybe have struct here to allow a little bit more flexibility. If there are other parameters that folks may want to pass in the future, having a struct would give us more flexibility.
Something like a snapshot source message or something?
Yeah.
So it will be separate from because we have that one in the response. So this one, your suggestion should be different.
Yeah,
okay.
I guess it would be like snapshot request or what James suggested.
Okay, snapshot. Okay. Snapshot request object or something. Okay. Yeah, that definitely seems better. Yeah.
So in the future, when we have a restore volume to snapshot level, are we going to add a new function for that or continue over?
Yes, because that's a whole different operation, right? We don't have anything equivalent of modify an existing volume to do something else. So restore volume, I agree, should be a separate method.
I still disagree with the create volume, but I think I'm outvoted.
Okay. Is somebody trying to talk or is that just background noise? Sounds like background noise. Go ahead, Shing.
Okay. Okay, so create volume response, we added this optional field of source snapshot ID. I think this is just for information purpose. And here, so those are the additional controller capabilities. So we add a few: create, delete snapshot, list snapshots, request get snapshot. So I'll explain this a little bit because this is because some cloud providers will upload the snapshot to some place like a S3 object store after the snapshot is cut. So that can take very long time, it could take like hours. We have this required get snapshot to basically it's like get the status of snapshot, make sure that it's already uploaded. So when you create a snapshot, that will come back after the snapshot is cut. But then you'll have to call the get snapshot for the upload to finish. So that's why we have two here. We have this requires get snapshot as a separate capability, and also because not every storage system has this upload process. So this is optional. But if this requires get snapshot is there, then the CO will have to call get snapshot after create snapshot.
So I question the need for this capability because, I mean, I guess theoretically any of our operations could take a long time. And it seems like with this capability, we're special casing the create snapshot operation. We're saying, well, this is a special kind of operation that might take a long time. And so we're adding this.
I had the same thought when I first saw this, and I talked to Xing about it. And apparently, for snapshots, there's a couple of different end states that the CO could be interested in, not just the fact that the operation is completed. There is the fact that the snapshot has been taken and that the workload that's using that volume can be unpaused, basically. But that at that point, it doesn't mean that the snapshot is ready to consume. It's only after the upload of the snapshot is completed in some storage systems that it's actually ready to consume. So there's two terminal states, or two states that the CO is interested in. One is that that the workload can be restarted, and the second is that the snapshot is actually complete. And so the proposal here that she has is that the create snapshot returns as soon as the workload can be unblocked. And then if the workload being unblocked is different from the snapshot actually being ready, then this capability exists. That means the CO must call a follow-up get snapshot to verify whether the snapshot is ready to use or not. And that's going to block until it's ready to use.
So, okay, so that helps give some context. So I like that, thanks. I think it would be useful to capture some of that context somewhere in this document.
Yeah, I agree.
It's actually in the document. This one, I think we are looking at the generated file, right? Which is just
okay.
the spec. If you look at the spec itself, actually has a paragraph describing that we need to do the unfreeze right after the snapshot is cut. Yeah, it's actually.
It would be good to put it in the comments as well.
Okay, sure.
Clarity.
Okay.
I guess the other.
Oh, but this is the okay. So if I add that in this place, that should be okay. So it should generate. Okay, all right.
As long as it's a comment that gets generated.
Okay.
So I still am kind of questioning the need for this as a capability. If storage providers have kind of the multiple, I don't want to say terminal states, but there's like states a snapshot can exist in, right? Like, yeah, the snapshot was taken, but it's not available, or whatever. Maybe there's 5 states or 10 states, right? Can we communicate? Can we somehow communicate information in the response of a create snapshot request? So, like in this case, you create a snapshot, and then the response would be, yeah, the snapshot was taken and it's available, or it would be, yeah, the snapshot was taken but it's not available yet, and so someone's got to follow up with a list or a get to make sure it's there. Like, I don't know why we need a capability.
Are you talking about the status? Are you talking about the like status of the snapshot, something like that? Like snapshot is pending or it's ready, something like that?
Kind of. Well, it seems like what we're trying to do is, with this capability, is guide CO behavior with respect to the completion of a create snapshot operation. what I'm suggesting is that maybe instead of a capability to guide CO behavior, why don't we just return guidance parameters in the response to create snapshot?
Yeah, I'd be okay with that.
I thought the concern was those functions are synchronous, right? So if we are returning, was that a problem?
They are synchronous, but you can still define that. I'm thinking more about it. You could still define that the create volume call will complete when the CO should basically unpause the workload.
Okay.
And then it returns a status in the response, and the status could be basically ready to use or uploading.
Okay.
And then the CO will take a look at that response, the status, and say, oh, if it's ready to use, then I can immediately surface that to the end user. If it is uploading, then I can do a follow-up get volume call to wait for it to finish uploading. And then once it's done uploading, then I can let the user know that it's ready to use.
So we still need a get snapshot call?
You still need a get snapshot call.
Okay.
The response of the get snapshot call would be identical to the create snapshot call. Both of the responses should have a status. And the status, as far as I can tell, should only have two values in the beginning. One is ready to use, and the other is uploading.
Okay.
So one quick question here. A snapshot ID. Okay, so these are synchronous calls. They could take hours. They could take days. Eventually, the RPC call is going to time out and retry, and it's going to have to retry with some ID for the item potency.
Yeah, I think she specified that in the create snapshot call. Do you want to continue, Cheng?
Yeah, so where are we now? So we are now looking at this spec. Okay, create snapshot. Create snapshot. This create snapshot request has a volume ID, and of course that's the source that's required, and also has a name. So this name can be something that is generated by the CO. This is for the item potency. Or it can be a suggested name if the CO supports that. So caller can give a name as well. So
on the create volume side, we kept volume ID and name as the same field.
Create volume or create snapshot?
Create volume. So I believe create volume only has the name field.
Right.
In this case, is volume ID and name used? Name is used for item potency, and volume ID is used as the name of the snapshot to be created.
A volume ID is for the volume, right? Source is the source of the snapshot.
Okay, sorry, my bad.
Yeah,
that makes sense. Okay.
Yeah.
Because there's two IDs here, right? There's one from the CO side, and then the storage side is going to create its own, and there's going to have to map between the two. And I'm not sure that every storage provider is going to return its ID until it's completely finished. You know, so if you have like a long-running snapshot, and it times out, you're not going to get the volume ID.
If we rename the volume ID field just to like from volume ID, would that add clarity for people?
Yeah.
From volume source volume ID? Yeah. Okay. Okay. Okay, so Brad, do you have still have comments on the name, or are we okay now?
No, I think that helps. There's namespace. I know that it's kind of a Kubernetes construct, but there is going to be name collisions potentially, right?
Right, but if it's the ID, then if let's say generated ID, then should be fine, I think.
Okay.
Name would be could be cool.
I'm thinking that the cloud provider needs to generate a UUID for the snapshot.
Right. So the first one, right? If you see one, So I think the name is confusing because actually it's the ID for Kubernetes, right? It's actually a UUID.
There's volume
So
name,
maybe,
which could be useful in it, and then there's UUID that we need to have idempotency.
yeah, this one is actually UUID for Kubernetes. So probably need to add something here to say this actually could be a UUID. Would that be better?
Could we just have like maybe a string metadata? I mean, because there is unknown amounts of metadata that may be associated with a snapshot.
What would the purpose be? Would it be to be able to specify other parameters that you could tweak on the snapshot?
Yeah, just unknown stuff. I mean, it's hard to.
Yeah. So we have parameters, opaque parameters on the create volume call. I think we may end up in that place for snapshots, but let's start with not having it and see if it becomes a requirement. If it does, adding a parameters field should be pretty trivial.
Yeah, I think we discussed about that, and I think we removed it for now. It was initially started with that because volume has that.
Yeah, I think we walked through the potential uses, what we could pass through, and we realized that everything could be captured in these first class fields. So we didn't really need it, and let's not add it until we have a concrete use case for it.
I've got a concrete use case if you wanted to hear it now.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so in some systems, when we're creating snapshots, they're being created for a temporary use, and we want them to be automatically cleaned up or potentially cleaned up as a group. So it's more of a create parameter that we would reference later on when cleaning things up. But that would be helpful to have here.
Yeah, thanks for that use case. It's interesting.
That was Eric.
I guess the other one that I can think of is for systems that support synchronous replication. Some of those systems support snapshotting on the primary site and not necessarily on the secondary site, or I want to do it both. And so that's another thing that I think customers may want to be able to specify.
In that case, would you specify whether you're taking a snapshot on the primary or the secondary?
Or both, right.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so the interesting aspects of this is, I think on the Kubernetes side, Snapshots doesn't currently allow opaque parameters. So we'd have to make sure to think through that on the Kubernetes side. But I can buy these use cases, and I'm sure there's going to be more in the future. So I'd be okay with adding.
Well, I was going to say, like, there's some metadata calls. We're missing a lot of metadata calls from this spec, even just for the basic functions. Like, if I want to know when a snapshot was created or when it invalidates itself, how big it is, who owns it, all that kind of metadata, I don't know how you would get at it from this API.
Yeah, so the purpose of this spec is any first class field should be a field that in the response that the CO needs to interpret. So if any of the fields that you mentioned must be understood and parsed by the CO, then they should be first class fields. In the response, the only things that should be opaque are things that should just be passed through to the end user or kind of are just descriptive or something like that.
But which function call would I use to get that information? List snapshots?
So it depends on which use cases you're talking about.
Like if I wanted to know the date that the snapshot was created.
So I think if you look at the get snapshot response, she has information about the date in there. I'm not sure. Let me see.
Yeah, it's not there. I mean, if that's required, we can definitely add those. I mean, but I
wasn't saying that was specifically required. I'm just saying that there's arbitrary metadata that's going to be required, and we can't anticipate all of it. We can say some of it right now, but
So I think we should be very specific about those, and if they are pieces of data that the CO needs to interpret and be aware of, we should make them first-class fields. If we realize that they're just informative end user information, then we could add in a labels field or something. That could be useful even on the create volume response call, right? Today we don't have an opaque set of labels that are just describing a volume, because everything that we have in the create volume response is things that the CO will parse and interpret and do something with. It might help to be more concrete there with the examples.
Okay. I'm going to take that as a separate topic, I think. I think the metadata is a bigger problem than just snapshots.
Yeah, I mean, volumes have attributes, so there's no reason a snapshot might not have attributes, right? And those are just kind of like opaque things that, we identify in the spec that the provider it's a bucket that provider can use to kind of pass back information, right, about the volume. But a CO doesn't really interpret those attributes. Like I can see
the attributes I see as like more like a cookie. They're not intended to be exposed to the end user necessarily. They're more just for for a plugin to return opaque information and then get it back in a future call. I'm not sure whether that is going to be a requirement in this case, because once a snapshot is created, the only follow-up call is going to be create a new volume from this snapshot, or in the future possibly restore this current volume to a given snapshot.
Well, you're coming at it from the state of Kubernetes, which maintains its own state about snapshots, right? If you're some other cloud provider and you want to list all the snapshots and then see the ownership of them or dates or other metadata.
So in that case, you would call I think there's a list volume call in here, or list snapshots. There we go. So if you call list snapshots, you should be able to discover the snapshots. And then the snapshots that are listed here should have all the information that the CO needs. If the response doesn't have the information that you need, then we should consider adding that as a field.
So while we're on the topic of this metadata, I see there's a description field for snapshots. Is there a reason why we've decided to first class that? Because I don't know how a CO is expected to understand what's in the description field.
That's a good question.
That's just informational, I think. That's not really...
How is it intended to be used?
I think this was a suggestion in the review, I think. Basically, this is really just for a description. If, let's say, if users see this description, they probably know, okay, this is the snapshot that they took. But, I mean, other than that, other than that, I don't see much other use. But
so maybe we should eliminate this field and then in the future consider something closer to what Brad was suggesting, which is kind of like a opaque labels map. Okay,
so we can actually add the attributes here if that is helpful, because
so I don't think we have a use case for attributes just yet. So right now I would like to start with just a minimalist API and see what is absolutely necessary and extend it. So at this point, I would argue, let's just get rid of description altogether. And then in the future, if there's a use case there's two sets of use cases that I see. One is an opaque list of descriptors or attributes that the plugin wants to expose to the end user. Those would just be labels. So you could have a map of string to string labels in the future, possibly. That the purpose of that would be the CO would just expose that to the end user as descriptive information. For now, I say let's start without that and see if it's necessary. And the second would be attributes, similar to what we have on the create volume call today. And the create volume call today, they serve as a cookie between different volume operations. For example, between create volume and controller publish and node publish, etc. I don't see that use case on the snapshot side yet either. So I would prefer not to have it to start with, to keep the API simple. But we can consider that in the future.
Okay.
So one field that might be missing here for Snapshot is the creation date time on the storage system. Since snapshots are point-in-time copies, it seems like that might be an interesting attribute to expose.
Yeah, timestamp.
So I think we talked about this, Shang, and we realized
in the tags actually in the tags we have that in. It's actually so there's a note there. It is actually in the create snapshot, not in the response, but it's in the create snapshot request. I think it's right there. I think. Yeah, tags. So currently in the snapshot implementation in external storage, we actually have this tags. That tags has a timestamp. It was generated by the controller and passed it on to the cloud provider. I think we decided not to use that for now. So
sorry, are you talking about this field?
Yeah, this tags. Yeah, so this
Okay.
one is actually currently in the current snapshot implementation in external storage actually has this field. It's actually
So the purpose of this is on the create volume side, the CO will specify when it created a snapshot or when it requested the snapshot.
Yeah, so this one has the name, has a few things, has a namespace, name, and the timestamp. So at that time, we initially thought we need this one to make sure it's unique, but then we discussed about it, thinking that just to have the UID should be enough.
Right.
But having the tags, of course, is helpful. So it basically you can look at that on your storage system and see, okay, this is this snapshot is coming from Kubernetes. That's one thing, and then it also has timestamp. So I don't know whether we want to add this or we want to just add a timestamp itself as a separate field, or I don't know.
So I don't know, how important is it to have the timestamp on the request side? So I think what Eric is arguing is on the response side, there should be a timestamp. You're arguing that there's potentially a need on the request side. How important is that?
Well, actually right now, I think we discussed about it and then we decided it's not needed anymore, because at that time, when we implement the snapshot feature in external storage, we decided that we need a timestamp to make sure the snapshot is unique. But I think we talked about just using UID should be enough. So I think it's fine not to add it here, but just to add that in the return side, response side. I think
okay.
Fine.
I think that makes sense to me. So
so the only thing I think is that because it was in the snapshot controller, the timestamp was generated by the snapshot controller and passed to the cloud provider, right? So that's why if you don't pass it in, then the timestamp will be generated by the
plugin.
By the plugin itself. Okay.
Or the storage system as well, right? The timestamp passed in, by the time that gets to the storage system, there could be a delay there. And so it seems like the storage system should have the definitive say on what the creation time of this particular snapshot is. That's kind of what I was going for here.
Okay.
Yeah, I guess a creation timestamp could be useful for the CO to just be able to sort the snapshots that are created when it surfaces them to the user. So I'm okay with adding that on the response.
Okay.
On the request side, I forgot there was this tags thing, and it sounds like you were intending to use the tags for things like date, which would be generated by CO. But anything that must be generated by the CO should be a first-class field on the request, because opaque fields don't make sense in that regard. You have to define on the request explicitly what it is that you want the CO to pass in. The only fields that should be opaque on the request are fields that are passed through by the CO, fields that are generated by the end user. And in that case, we suggested adding parameters above.
Yeah.
So I think parameters make sense, and tags here should be removed.
Why is
Okay,
data
yeah,
generated by the CO? I mean, it seems a snapshot would know when it was taken, not the
Right.
CO
I think
knows
we
the snapshot when
discussed that that's not needed anymore.
This is
Okay.
actually, if you see, this is in comments. I didn't really add it. I think it's a note here saying maybe in the future we
Okay.
want to add this. So then, let's say if it's like a cloud provider, right? When they see tags from Kubernetes, they know, okay, those are generated by Kubernetes. They don't want to touch it.
Okay. So what this is more like a cookie from the CO back to the CO. Basically, the CO tags a particular snapshot with some opaque metadata, and then in the future, it can retrieve that metadata off that, right? Okay, that makes sense. That's something that we don't have on the create volume side, and I think we should try to be consistent.
Yeah.
I think it might actually be useful in both cases then.
Yeah, it's actually in the in-tree volume create actually has that. For the cloud provider. Yeah, so that's why we actually have the same thing for Snapshot.
Let's start without it and see if there is an absolute requirement for it, and then we can consider adding it in on both the create volume and the create snapshot.
Okay.
Okay. So that is the create snapshot request, and the create snapshot response just returns a snapshot object which contains the restored size and the size. Do you want to talk about what the difference between these two are?
Yeah, this two. So the restored size is really the size of the data that was written on the snapshot, which is useful when you create a volume from the snapshot because you want to know how big your volume needs to be. And the size is basically whatever quota you take when you take that snapshot. So the size of the snapshot. So this one should be bigger than the restored size or the same. Yeah, so that's why we have two here.
Okay. Does that make sense to everyone else?
I have a question on this. Is there a way for CO to know about the size of the snapshot before it actually called create snapshot? So that I'm asking is because like I think one case is like you don't have enough space to create a snapshot. How does the CO avoid calling create snapshot if it knows about there's not enough space from the storage system? Or there's no way? I'm just asking, like, is there a way?
I don't think there is a way.
It's probably depending on, well, it would be depending on the volume size, right? You take a snapshot from the volume. So if you, from your volume, you will find out how much data is needed.
Yeah, but in some systems, it might be the size of the volume used bytes instead of the actual size of the volume.
So the snapshot size, okay, so the snapshot size at time 0 is 0, right? It's the volume. There's no extra space by the snapshot. It's once you start writing to the volume that it diverges and has size.
Yeah, I think what G is asking for is, before I take a snapshot, is there a way for me to know whether it's going to succeed or not? And I don't think you will. I think you just have to call through to create the snapshot and then find out.
You probably want to know the volume size or the remaining space on the storage device.
Or is there a maximum size I can assume? Like for example, I just be conservative at the CO side, assuming that if there's not enough space for the maximum potential size from the snapshot, I will just fail, something like this. Well, even I think it's okay to not have that information, but I think we should have some error code to indicate that there's not enough space for creating a snapshot.
Yeah, I think it makes sense as an error code. We can go down to errors.
So the maximum would be the size of the volume, right? So the size of your, if your volume has size, so that would be the maximum, I think.
I see. Is that true for all the storage systems? Or
yeah, it is, right? So I think right now the volume, I don't see that it only has like one like bytes, right? Something like it's just one parameter. It does not say like how much is really consumed, right? So it only has like this one size that you basically allocate this space for this volume. So we don't really have that much information from there. If the volume also has like two sides, maybe that might be more helpful. I don't know.
Okay, I see.
Yeah, I'm not a real fan of these two different sizes, because I think this is going to be way too implementation dependent on what the actual backend storage system is doing. You know, I can imagine like having that maximum size just from the standpoint of whenever I, you know, for Kubernetes, for instance, whenever I go and create that new PV, right, I need to know what the size of that PV is going to be, right, so Kubernetes can create the object. But the fact that the actual storage consumed in the back end is likely to have a very unpredictable size. You know, like Brad mentioned, right, whenever you first take the snapshot, it, in a lot of implementations, can end up being effectively zero until there are writes to the volume from which that snapshot was created, right? And so we're basically ending up with a number that's going to change over time, which seems like we really shouldn't get involved with that and just kind of leave it up to the back-end storage system. And it's also very common to not even provision enough free space in the back end such that it could fully diverge, right? Because thin provisioning is so common in storage systems. You may only leave, say, 10% spare capacity for your snapshots because you know you have low churn in the volume, right? So it's not even useful from the standpoint of, you know, can I look at the size of my volume and the free space that is reported, and, you know, does that even allow me to take a snapshot?
Okay, so I think all this kind of goes to show that there's many ways to implement this, right? And we probably shouldn't try to peg one particular way, but leave it open with opaque metadata.
I like leaving it open. I think there are storage systems where this information would be important. I know on GCE PDs, when a snapshot is taken, both of these bits are returned. The first one is important, like you said, for being able to know when you're creating a new volume, how to size that volume. The second bit would be interesting to know how much space you're actually consuming, because storage is not free, and that information should be surfaced to the end user. If I take a snapshot and it's a few kilobytes versus I take a snapshot and it's a few hundred megabytes, and I'm paying for that storage, it would be important for me to know that. I agree that based on implementation, this could return zero and then at some later point end up being non-zero if you do a subsequent follow-up get snapshot call. I'm not sure what a good way to get around that is, but I don't think eliminating it altogether is the right answer.
Hey, Saad, is a CEO going to reason about this field?
They would surface it back to the end user.
So if the CEO is not going to reason about it, is there a reason it needs to be a first-class field?
That's a good point. It could be an opaque field. But we don't have opaque fields on the response yet, so.
The attributes, is that opaque or is that?
Attributes is different. Attributes is a cookie.
Okay.
What this would be is kind of like, I don't know, labels or something.
Metadata.
So this is also optional, right? So basically if it's like zero, then meaning this is unknown. So this is not saying that you must provide this.
That's the trick, right? Is defining what must be provided and what the cloud provider can count on always being there and what the implementer has to implement. And I'm not sure we're crisp enough on some of these things. Like a lot of this stuff is metadata. We can't have the CO counting on it being there if it can't be implemented in some storage system.
Yeah, also I don't like the 0 being like unknown, because I think like we cannot distinguish between the case where the size is actually 0 versus it's unknown.
Yeah.
Can we make this a pointer?
Pointer, okay.
And that way, if it's specified, it's explicit.
I mean, you don't get pointers in protobuf, but you could make it a message, or you could use the well-known, like a well-known type. Protobuf has well-known types so that you can distinguish between not present and 0.
Well, actually the size on the volume is also, it could also be 0 if you look at the spec volume. So.
Yeah, kind of along those lines, I wonder if we should talk about consumed here, consumed size, because
I think that's the intention of this second size here.
Right. So restore size, is that the logical block range? Is that the?
I think the first one, the restore size, is the one that is the data written. So it's more, I think that's more like the consumed size that you're talking about, unless I misunderstood.
Could you clarify what you mean by consumed size?
So if we create a 10 gig PV and then I take a snapshot of it, is this restored size 10 gig, or is it the blocks that I've written into it?
The blocks that you written to it. So it could be smaller than 10 or equal.
I see. So, okay. So the restore size is the smaller one, and then size is the logical block range?
Yeah, that's basically how much how much quota you take. Yeah, I don't know. This one is pretty.
Okay, that's a little confusing. I thought it was the other way around, but that's a little confusing to me.
Yeah, the naming, I don't know, we can either, we should clarify. Restored size honestly makes sense to me. It means it's the size of the snapshot when it is restored, but if there's a less confusing name, I'd be open to that. I wanted to close on whether we should have a size field at all or just leave it opaque. I think it's good to start with a minimalist API and add things to it as you need. So I would be okay removing this for now and adding it in the future if we need it. But I don't know enough about snapshots to know whether this value is something that a cluster orchestrator will require or will absolutely need. It sounds like it shouldn't, and the only purpose is informative for the end user. And if that's the case, then it could potentially be passed through as an opaque parameter.
Yeah, I would be leaning towards just having one, just have the first one and not having two. It's very confusing.
Does anybody?
Well, I remember before when we discussed this, and we basically agreed that these two are like interesting for even for the controller. Because if the user wants to restore the snapshot to the volume, then we use the create volume. Mm-hmm. And we can specify the size of the volume. And this size has to be, large enough to contain the data from the snapshot.
Right. So that would be restored size.
Exactly. Now, if I take the snapshot, it's going to occupy some space eventually in GCE, AWS.
Right.
I pay money for this. So I want to know how much space does it take. That's the size of the snapshot. That was the purpose of these two.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe we might save some of them in the opaque data. I don't know. We didn't discuss the opaque labels before, but again, we thought these two numbers are quite important, quite interesting, even to the controller.
I agree that the first one is interesting to the controller. I would argue that the second one is interesting more to the end user than the controller. Unless the controller is going to take that field and, I don't know, like try to put a dollar value on it and then surface a dollar value to the user, which they could, but I don't see that happening.
Well, I mean, it's useful when like the CEO wants to do like resource management, like say, hey, this snapshot takes 1
yeah.
gig, and I want to make sure that the volume that people want to create, like you do resource management and you have a like limited pool with a fixed size, and then whenever someone creates a snapshot, you want to deduct that snapshot size from the entire pool so that people don't create volume that's larger than the rest of the size of the pool. So something like this. I can see use cases where some CEO might want to know about that information and react on that. But as someone mentioned before, that it's going to be complicated because of all the kind of backend implementation, copy on write, thing provisioning, that would be complicated. Yeah, I don't know the answer for that, but I can see use cases that people might want to know that information.
Yeah, I mean, we also have to acknowledge that in some cases it's not even possible to know that information, right? So this certainly can't be a mandatory thing because if, for instance, so in all the examples that we've been talking about right now, we've been really looking at a primary volume and a single snapshot, right? But if I were to do something like have my volume take 2 snapshots in quick succession and then do some writes into my primary volume, I'm clearly consuming some space in snapshots, but those 2 that I took may be completely overlapping. I'm not sure how I could possibly allocate that divergent capacity, right, to one of those 2 snapshots, because it's not the case that if I were to delete a snapshot, one of those 2, I would get exactly 0 space back, right? Because the other one would still be holding on to all those divergent blocks. So it's—
Sorry, this is just for my own edification. If I take 2 snapshots in quick succession, and the first one, if there's no previous snapshots, maybe the size of the data, which may be hundreds of megabytes or gigabytes. The second snapshot could potentially be just the size of the diff. So it would be potentially much smaller. So could you clarify based on that what you mean?
Okay. I guess I was sort of looking at it from the standpoint of they're all diffs off of what is the active volume as opposed to off of the base snapshot.
Okay.
Right? Because you've kind of got the active volume, and then I take a snapshot, at time t, and that just kind of gets a reference to all of the blocks that are in use, and then the volume itself continues to evolve. And that snapshot from time t is now holding on to references from blocks that were essentially freed or overwritten in the active volume. And so the space consumed by that single snapshot is increasing over time because it is essentially the diff. But if I go and instead of just taking 1 snapshot, I take 2 in rapid succession, I've now got basically 2 references to what is this diff that's slowly growing over time, right? As I continue writing to the active volume. And it's the case that if I delete one of those 2 snapshots, I'm not going to get any space back. It's just that my ref count goes from 2 to 1 on those blocks that are being held. And so in that respect, having this size notion isn't getting me any closer to answering the question of, gee, my backend storage system is now running low on space. How much do I get back if I delete this snapshot? Because the answer is different if I delete one or both.
In that case, if the plugin reported 0, would that be the correct answer? Meaning if you delete the snapshot, you're not actually recovering any space.
Yes, although it would be a little weird because I could ask it for snapshot 1 and the answer is 0. I ask it for snapshot 2, the answer is 0. And then I go and delete snapshot 1 and I ask it again for snapshot 2 and now it might say 100 megs.
Right. So the difference is this value can change over time. It's not immutable. And that is confusing.
Yes.
Yep.
And even some storage systems can't estimate that.
Yeah, I think those are all great points.
Yeah, I totally like that example. I think like now I feel like this information is not that useful for the CO, given that CO cannot solely rely on that information to properly calculate the available capacity. I don't see a reason that I want to keep that size at this moment, given those examples.
Yeah, I would agree. I'd say we can make it an opaque field in the future. I don't see any opaque fields in the response right now. We could consider adding one, but I would be okay just dropping this altogether for now then. What do you think, Xing and Tomas?
Yeah, that's fine to me.
Yeah, well, I was looking at it from the perspective of the cloud storage systems,
Yeah, and that makes sense. But I think as long as there's some way to return opaque information to the end user, then that use case can be satisfied.
Agree.
If you guys want to add that in, feel free. I don't know what that field would be called, but yeah. Okay, cool. We are out of time. If you guys are interested in following up on this PR, please do so offline. It sounds like in general, there's no big blockers in terms of getting this in. I think it's just the minor details that everybody's interested in. So let's follow up offline. And if it's important, then we can raise this at the next meeting again.
Cool.
Right, sounds good.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye.